You take all of the elements that make good television and do the exact opposite. You have Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Low production values, simple set, unlikely star. Yet, it worked.
Hello. I've always felt that I didn't need to put on a funny hat or jump through the hoop to have a relationship with a child.
He was always trying to get a message across in every show.
A week on death.
What does assassination mean?
On divorce.
Some people get married, and after a while, they're so unhappy that they don't want to be married anymore.
He was radical. I know everyone says that, but he was radical.
They didn't want black people to come and swim in their swimming pools. My being on the program was a statement for Fred.
Love is at the root of everything. All learning, all relationships, love or the lack of it. Children have very deep feelings, just the way everybody does. There must be times when you do feel blue. I'm not feeling blue right now, though.
Me neither.
Won't you be my neighbor? Well, I suppose it's an invitation. It's an invitation for somebody to be close to you. The greatest thing that we can do is to help somebody know that they're loved and capable of loving. Won't you please won't you be my neighbor?
Welcome back to Bandwagon fans. This is Jeff, and I'm joined today by...
I'm Scott Purcell.
And we are here at Creatista Studios, and we're going to be talking about Won't You Be My Neighbor in just a moment. But real quick, you want to tell everybody about Creatista and kind of what you guys do here?
Yeah, sure. We're kind of set up in this little corner of our studio here in South Tucson, Arizona. We're a film, video, and commercial photography production house. So we do film and video work. One of the reasons I'm really interested in talking today about the movie we just saw is I do some documentary work. So I enjoy that as a form, both as taking it in and as something that we do here as part of our job. And we do stock photography, lots of different film and video production. And kind of I don't want to say we're all-purpose because we have specialties, but we do a lot of different kinds of work in those areas.
And I'll go ahead and there'll be a link to your website down below.
Thank you.
And so let's get started. So
yes.
This is Won't You Be My Neighbor. This is the documentary about Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Initial thoughts? Just kind of so there's no spoilers to worry about. We're just gonna talk about everything. This isn't so much a review. This isn't a review so much as it is a discussion.
Right.
And first off, I kind of tossed off to you as a Hail Mary because I'm still having a hard time processing emotionally what we just saw.
Yeah.
When I'm ready in a couple minutes, that's what I'm actually going to talk about. Is just the intensity of the feelings that watching this documentary had for not just me,
absolutely.
But everybody in the theater.
Right. Yeah, we were laughing a little bit because the opening credits, which had nothing to do with Fred Rogers or Mr. Rogers, were just like, the name of the production company was going, and I started like crying because I was just anticipating what actually ended up being the case was that there's a real there is an intensity and depth of feeling both to the guy, to Fred Rogers, but also to this film. I mean, I think they got it right.
Yeah. So I've been dying to see this movie for a couple months now. I saw the trailer a couple months ago. And I have a hard time just getting through the trailers. Like I knew this was going to be pretty emotional, and just like you, as soon as the movie started, I'm like, it was almost like that part of the roller coaster where you start going up and you start clenching because you know what's happening.
Click, yeah.
But we'll kind of I want to table that conversation for a minute and come back to it towards the end about really why I think that the movie triggered that kind of reaction.
Yeah, sure. And we can we'll talk a little bit about how they did that kind of effectively without doing it in a real manipulative way. I think they were really quite artful in that.
So you're the documentary filmmaker. So you before we started recording, you were talking a little bit about some of the technical aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
You want to kind of run through some of those things that you were noticing?
Yeah, sure. Particularly if we think of it as technical as being the sort of practical and pragmatic sort of like, how do you make a documentary? You know, I was thinking about the sheer amount of footage that they had to go through, which is a good problem to have, but it's still, you know, thinking about starting with what would literally be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, and some of the things I know they knew where to go look. I'm sure they didn't look at all of it, but in that,
Do you think they started with the Wikipedia page?
maybe they did. So, I think that it was a very conventional documentary, extremely conventionally structured. The only thing that would have been absolutely like dead on conventional that they didn't quite do, but they almost did, was if they had done it in a precisely exactly linear fashion.
Right.
I mean, if they had said, here's a picture of Fred being born, here's a picture of Fred doing this, and this, and oh, here he is, you know, at the end of his life. They kind of did that. I think the film definitely shows an arc and a progression, but it does jump around in his life a little bit and takes on more sort of specific subjects, and then maybe looks at how that subject might have sort of like how we might have seen that sort of play out in his life. But there is definitely a sense of like, this happened early, this happened in the middle, and it does kind of follow that linear structure, but it doesn't mind moving away from that sometimes either.
Just a quick technical note, we are shooting in Tucson. It's like 104 degrees outside, so you are going to see like drinking and running up sweat, and that's just...
And we turned off the air conditioner because it makes noise.
So you mentioned they covered the childhood, and that they did address his childhood and how that impacted his work, but that didn't come in until like 3/4 of the way into the film.
Right.
Which kind of was interesting. They had. It was clear to me that the filmmakers for the documentary were in some way carrying on his message.
Absolutely.
So but at no point did were they too on the nose, or they try to hammer the point too hard. They made a reference early on to building a wall. But they didn't go back to it. It wasn't, you know.
Right.
And in some ways, I would just they did talk a lot about his will, and in some ways, just his very existence was enough to be an opposition to what he viewed as you know, he mentioned a couple times forces of evil or just bad people in the world, and just his mere existence and his refusal to change his innate goodness was his form of resistance, and the filmmakers did a really good job of maintaining that kind of attitude, or that type of technique, his technique into the film itself.
Yeah, I think so. You know, it's we were having a little lunch before we started shooting this, and I was reflecting because on our little smart speaker, Lou Reed, "Take a Walk on the Wild Side," was playing, and I thought, you know, here are two people who you could argue at least were contemporaries, probably about the same age, railing against the system in radically different ways. I mean, a Lou Reed song and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on the surface look hardly like they have anything at all to do with each other, and yet I don't think that Fred Rogers would have said that what he was doing was either sort of in protest of the sort of dominant culture at the time, but he was definitely working against aspects in the dominant culture.
I think, based on some of the stuff he said there, I think he would have consciously said he was protesting against it. And especially towards later in life, he was he was getting pretty angry and adamant, you know. But he never shied away from expressing any feeling, even if it was anger. He just did it. He always did it in a way that he thought was conducive towards a peaceful outcome.
Right.
one analogy that I really like to use about life in general is the board game Chutes and Ladders, or Snakes and Ladders for some parts of the world. And you can kind of use it as a model to map out life, where your ladders are decisions that lead to peaceful, positive outcomes, and your chutes or snakes are decisions that lead to increased hostility or increased strife. And Mr. Rogers, like every decision he made was based on taking that ladder up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and he was consciously in opposition to people that were trying to go a different direction.
Yeah, I'm sure. I was thinking a little bit about getting into philosophy a little bit, but about predetermination. And I was thinking, does Mr. Rogers, does he appear fully formed, and that, you know, there's this guy that just has this sort of way of being in the world? Does he evolve to that in some way that is based on the experiences that he has? But also, like, how much of Mr. Rogers is a feedback loop for Mr. Rogers? It's like you do, you know, and I was watching the film and I was thinking, clearly he's watching certain levels of success that he's having. Like, he's watching himself interact with kids. He wants to give the kids a better life. I'm convinced of that. He wants to help them see life in a better way, deal with difficult things. He's actually seeing in his feedback loop that that's working. And because that's working, he becomes more like Mr. Rogers. And it seems like over the course of his life, you know, he started as Mr. Rogers, but he really ended up as Mr. Rogers.
All right, so now we're going to kind of take it contemporary, because if you took everything you just said and replaced Mr. Rogers with Donald Trump, it would be just as valid.
It's the feedback loop.
I've heard the exact same argument made about Donald Trump, that when he does his rallies, he'll throw out a comment about the wall, and people cheer. He's like, "Oh, the wall is a good idea."
Right.
So, and well, there's a few things throughout watching this documentary that struck me. One of them was the arguments that Mr. Rogers was having in the 60s is the same damn arguments we're having now. Like, literally nothing has changed.
Right.
There was early on in the film, I mentioned they talked about a wall. It was a wall in what is it, Make Believe Land?
Yes.
Land of Make Believe. Yeah, Land of Make Believe, where King Friday the 13th is opposed to change. So
and by the way, this was in the first week that the show was on.
Yeah.
So he's already being political.
Yeah. Week one of the show.
One.
King Friday the 13th is opposed to change, so he's trying to build a wall to keep out anybody that's going to change his world.
Right.
And I'm like, is Kabuki theater inaccurate? I don't know. I was going to look that up, but it just seems like it doesn't matter what has happened in the last 40, 50 years.
Right.
It's the same flippant argument.
Right.
And that gets directly into why it had such an emotional impact for me.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't watch Mr. Rogers maybe for a couple years as a kid, but his target audience is like 2 to 4.
Yeah, very young. Yeah, very young.
And when you grow out of Mr. Rogers, you grow out of it hard. Like,
Right.
It is the least cool thing in the world as a kid to keep watching Mr. Rogers. You may as well still be wearing diapers.
Right.
And man, and now looking back at that, it's like, that's so sad.
Yeah, it really is in a way. Because it's funny, because as adults, like, we could probably sit down and watch the show and get a lot of the, I don't even want to say it's subcontext, because I don't think he was trying to throw a lot of stuff out as subcontext, but maybe as adults we might understand, like, how important some of the messages were that he was trying to get across, and some of the things that he was trying to communicate to kids, realizing how often that kids like that don't get spoken to in a way that is genuine and that respects them
Yeah.
as people. And one of the things that I do remember, they kind of said this in the film, but I remember reading this about him, and some of the other people they talked about at the time, like Dr. Benjamin Spock and T. Barry Brazelton, right? Some of the people who were working with kind of rethinking like how we interact with kids is actually how intense the emotions that children have are. So thinking that because they're unformed, they don't really think about things and stuff to them, it's not really that big a deal, is like he did not believe that.
Right.
Mr. Rogers was all about, no, these kids, they're afraid of death, they're afraid of getting hurt, they're afraid of being socially ostracized, they need their parents to continually be telling them, we're here for you, we're here to help you through this stuff. So
one of the things that kind of struck me about the movie and the experience of watching it was the irony of a room full of people trying to suppress their emotions while watching a documentary about a guy
right.
encouraging the free flow of emotions.
Right.
There were certain points in the movie where, like we talked about, like right off the bat, I heard you sniffling. I sniffled a couple times, and there were like certain moments where you could just hear like the entire audience go.
Right.
Was it what was the kid's name? Jeff Erlickson, I think. Like as soon as they brought him out, like the entire audience just went, no.
Right.
But you were going to talk a little bit about what, from a technical standpoint, how the filmmakers went about that.
Yeah, I think and again, what might be interesting about that is that it was technically not very technical. There are things that you can do, and there are ways that you can weave images together that can elicit a particular emotional response. There were actually, like, back in the turn of the 20th century, the Russians were doing these experiments with you play this image and then play this image, and then how do people feel about it? You do a guy's deadpan face and then an apple. So, 3 seconds of face, 3 seconds of apple, and people say, oh, he's hungry. And then, 3 seconds of face and 3 seconds of a broken teacup, and they're, oh, he's sad. Same face though.
Yeah.
Hasn't changed anything. So there are things that you can do in a film. I think everybody knows that's right, to change how people feel, and I think that happens in documentaries, and even now it really happens in documentaries a lot because a lot of documentaries are definitely coming from a certain viewpoint. They want you to walk away with an idea, and this movie wants you to walk away with an idea about Fred Rogers. I don't think that there's any question
right.
that they want you to do that. But I thought that they were very maybe not careful, but just thoughtful about not piling on things that were designed particularly to create an emotion in you. I think that they realized, and I think this was the right decision, I think that they realized that the content itself, that this guy was like such a good guy, and the impact that he had on people was such a good and positive impact that you would have the emotional response. And I know I did, because I was literally like crying through like half of the film, even through some of the stuff where you're almost kind of wondering, it's like, I'm not even sure why I'm having this emotional response. I just like this guy so much.
Right. And for me, the emotional response, I mean, from the first time I saw the trailer, I knew I was going to have this response, and I knew why I was going to have this response. There is such dissonance between the life or the way of living that Fred Rogers was espousing versus what he was dealing with in the 60s and up until he died, and what we're dealing with now.
Right.
And it's so the contrast between the hope of what could be versus the reality of what is just kind of overwhelming when you realize there actually are decent people out there.
Right.
To the point where in the movie, you mentioned when we were talking off camera how the movie didn't belabor any point. It put something in front of you, said what it is, and then it moved on to something else.
Right.
One of the points that it put in front of everybody was, and I just totally lost my train of thought. which happens sometimes. But
well, let me tell you, one of the things that I thought was interesting that you can do in a documentary film is particularly one that is set against a particular time period or is set against a progression of time periods, is you can use a lot of footage from those things. And this movie does Bobby Kennedy assassination. This movie does, 9/11. This movie has footage from, I think there was some footage in there from Vietnam. So there are like moments where the movie is kind of saying, hey, we want you to understand what Fred Rogers was responding to. And so it would, but even then, and even with that, it wasn't a club, and racial, like really horrible things happening to black people, right? I mean, it shared some of that, but it put the focus back on Fred Rogers and what he was doing, and really nobody made a decision for you what to think about that.
Right.
Nobody came out and said, oh, by the way, so you need to think Fred Rogers is this. It really allowed you to walk away with your own sort of interpretation of what he was doing and how he was doing it.
Yeah, so I remember what I was leading towards. One of the things they put in front of us that they didn't belabor was the backlash to Fred Rogers.
Right.
Particularly, they showed a clip of Brian Kilmeade from Fox News, and this whole movement to blame Fred Rogers for America failing.
Right. Entitled kids.
Yeah.
Right.
And really and really the only thing Mr. Rogers is saying people are entitled to is to be treated with dignity.
Right.
And love and respect.
Right.
And then there was they talked a little bit about at his funeral there was a protest, and they're like, yeah, we know he's not gay, but he was tolerant of gays,
Yeah.
and that's enough for us to hate him.
Right.
It's just the madness of how people can be, how people can view other people so differently.
Right. And even in that, which I thought was fascinating, and I have a tiny bit of experience with something that was like that, which was covering this group of people who were protested by basically your Westboro Baptist Church types with the signs that you can imagine. And one of the people that I ended up photographing was this little girl. I mean, she was probably like all of 7 years old or something. And I remember the sort of like my real ambivalent feelings towards photographing her, because I kind of wanted to show what was happening, and I was like right up in her face, and she clearly did not want me there. And thinking about some of these photos that they showed from outside his funeral of those same kind of protests, and it really brought back like that experience of me like interviewing people in those situations. And but it focused the film, of course this was his memorial service, so this wasn't Fred Rogers, but people were commenting, brought it back to kids and talked about like how badly they felt for the kids who were there as part of the protest, who clearly, and I've seen this myself, who clearly did not want to be there, but they were just shills.
That, I just, as you were talking about it, something clicked with me where that is probably the thesis of Fred Rogers' life and the documentary itself. Very, very early on in the film, Fred Rogers was talking and he was saying it's all about love. Everything you do is about love or the lack of it. And all the strife we see comes from a lack of love. And then you look at kind of his reaction to 9/11, and it's almost like it was inconceivable for him.
Right.
And like it wasn't just something terrible happened in the country. It was his entire worldview was falsified.
Right.
And we're almost at a point now where that entire worldview is being falsified on a daily basis.
Right.
And which brings the next question, more of a practical application. How do any of us aspire to be like Mr. Rogers? And in my parlance of game theory, a consummate altruist when you have consummate defectors. Mm-hmm. And if you continue the path of altruism, you're just opening the door for the defectors or people that are wanting to take from you, you're just leaving the door open for them to take and take and take. At some point, the opposition has to be concrete and directed at them. But then that would directly contradict the message of altruism that he was promoting. And so,
yeah, I don't think he saw his role as an antagonist, maybe,
right,
ever. And so although they did say, which was interesting, he could be a little sort of churlish, at times, particularly as he was older. Yeah,
they were definitely.
Yeah, which was it's kind of fun to think of him that way. I think so. But I guess maybe something that like my mainline Protestant clergy friends would probably call me on if I didn't at least bring this up is that there is a discussion throughout this film of sort of like where does this sort of ethic come from for him, and it's not a belabored thing.
Right.
There are no Bible verses. I mean, it's none of that, but it does talk about the fact that he eventually became ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and he saw this as part of his basically as part of his work in the world, what he should be doing, if I interpret that right. Having been around a lot of people who do that kind of work, I understand that they see that as a call. And I think he saw this as a call. So I think he might understand those ideas of game theory, but he might have said too, I can't spend too much time thinking about that, because what I feel that I am being driven to do here is this one thing. And to his credit, it seems like he did that. It seems like he was pretty much on track with doing that thing. Now, the question would become, or could become, all these years later, and this is a giant question, but did it make a bit of difference, right? I think it maybe did to some individuals.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, did it to a society? Maybe it did. I don't know.
Well, yes. I think the answer is
Okay.
so. We're seeing, so right now this is July 4th, 2018. You're seeing government agencies that are zero tolerance policy towards Hispanics. There is outright opposition to diversity. White supremacy has never been more prevalent. Well, okay, I won't say never.
Right. In recent memory.
Yeah. In my lifetime, white supremacy has never been as prominent as it is today, and as acceptable. 15 years ago, to say that you were opposed to diversity would have been unheard of.
Right.
And now, but the backlash to that movement is strong. And I think you can trace that directly to the influence that Fred Rogers had on people. Right. So he definitely had an impact. He had an influence on the country, and probably in ways that nobody would recognize until they go see this documentary and they're like, oh crap,
right,
that's where it came from.
Right. And that's why documentary is such a great form.
Yeah. Because
it does allow you, I mean, there were some things that I knew about even from college when I went to school for TV and film. I mean, I remember seeing his testimony to, I can't remember the name of the senator now, but basically like sort of stepping in and kind of saving PBS. There were probably some other things going on too, but I mean, I remember seeing that testimony, so I remember that from his life. But I don't remember him having his feet in the same little swimming pool with a black actor on his show and having them washing their feet together. Like, I don't remember that. So it's a great thing about a documentary is that it can serve all of that up on a plate.
Right.
And again, I think that they really did it artfully, without hitting us over the head with it. Let us decide what we wanted to think about those things.
Yeah. So on that note, is there anything else you wanted to touch on, or?
I just thought it was really well done. I mean, I would really suggest people go see this, but don't make the mistake that I did, which is not to take any tissue with me.
Yeah. I can't recommend this enough. if you're trying to understand America in 2018 through the lens of film or through going to movies, this is on the must-see list.
Absolutely.
And the movies that I would put on that list so far have been the remake of Death Wish, Adrift. Overboard. That's right. And don't waste your time with Adrift. So Death Wish, Overboard, and now Won't You Be My Neighbor. Right now, those three movies together really kind of show the crossroads of where America is right now, the United States is right now. Can't recommend this movie enough. I think this should be required viewing for every human being right now.
Yeah,
So,
I'm with you.
yeah, just a phenomenal movie, and thanks for hanging out. If you stuck through our discussion, and once again, I'm Jeff.
Scott,
Get on the bandwagon.
get on Bandwagon.